If your legal team missed a clause this obvious, maybe the $1 billion should stay in Dubai. Ethan Calloway's voice cut through the private dining room like cold steel, sharp enough to silence even the clinking crystal glasses beneath the golden chandelier light. Across the 20-foot walnut table, two Arab attorneys exchanged restrained looks while rain hammered softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Sheikh Omar Al Nasser remained perfectly still at the head of the table, one hand resting beside an untouched cup of cardamom coffee, his dark eyes unreadable beneath the warm amber glow. Ethan leaned back in his tailored navy suit, expensive watch catching the light as he smirked slightly and switched to Arabic without warning. Americans always overcomplicate contracts, he said casually to his legal advisor. At least the waitress won't understand enough to interrupt. Quiet laughter followed. Low, controlled. The kind rich men used when they believed the room belonged to them. Claire Whitmore heard every word. She stood near the end of the table holding a silver tray against her black uniform, posture calm, expression distant. 41 years old. Blonde hair twisted into a loose knot at the base of her neck. Pale gray eyes that rarely stayed on anyone too long. Invisible by design. Ethan barely glanced at her again as she stepped forward to refill the Sheikh's tea. Steam curled softly between them. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, plates clattered. Jazz piano drifted faintly through the restaurant like background static. Then Claire's hand stopped. Just slightly. Her eyes lowered to the Arabic appendix beside the Sheikh's signature page. One line. One handwritten amendment in dark blue ink. Ownership transfer upon succession. Permanent. Irrevocable. Her fingers tightened almost invisibly around the silver handle of the tray. Ethan kept talking. Once this closes, he said confidently, the infrastructure rights move immediately. Sheikh Omar reached for the pen, and Claire finally spoke. Softly, calmly. Actually, sir, her voice was so quiet the room nearly missed it. Ethan looked annoyed before he even turned around. Claire lifted her eyes toward the Sheikh instead. Clause 14 does not transfer temporary authority, she said carefully in fluent Arabic. It transfers permanent family ownership after death. Silence. Complete silence. Even the rain outside seemed farther away now. Ethan's smirk disappeared slowly. One of the attorneys straightened in his chair. Another stared directly at Claire for the first time all evening. And at the head of the table, Sheikh Omar looked up from the contract with sudden interest, studying the waitress standing beneath the chandelier light as though she had just stepped out of nowhere and into the center of the room. No one moved. Not immediately. The attorneys stared at Claire as if the room itself had shifted beneath their feet. Ethan Calloway slowly set his whiskey glass down beside the contract, the sharp click against polished wood sounding louder than it should have. What did you just say? He asked, his voice controlled now colder. Claire did not look at him. She kept her attention on Sheikh Omar, her posture calm beneath the warm chandelier light that softened the edges of her pale face. The amendment changes the succession structure, she repeated gently in Arabic. The wording is legal Gulf dialect. Very specific. The transfer becomes permanent after the primary holder passes away. One of the Sheikh's attorneys grabbed the contract immediately, flipping pages faster now, eyes scanning the handwritten addition near the bottom. Ethan leaned forward. That is impossible. My legal team reviewed this contract for 3 weeks. Then your legal team should review it again, Claire replied quietly. The room tightened. Not because she raised her voice, but because she did not. Outside the windows, rain streamed across the Manhattan skyline in silver lines while distant headlights blurred below like rivers of white and red. Somewhere behind them, a waiter stopped walking entirely. Even the jazz music from the main dining hall seemed to fade into the background. Ethan studied Claire carefully for the first time that night. Really studied her. The woman looked nothing like the corporate attorneys he dealt with every day. No designer jewelry. No expensive heels. Just a black high-collar waitress uniform and sensible shoes worn from long shifts. Yet there was something unsettling in her composure. She did not sound nervous. She sounded certain. Sheikh Omar finally spoke, his deep voice measured and smooth. You read formal Arabic? Claire gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Where did you learn legal terminology? Ethan asked immediately. Claire hesitated. Only for a second. A long time ago. Ethan did not like vague answers. His jaw tightened slightly beneath the dramatic side, lighting falling across the table. That is not an answer. Claire finally looked at him then. Her gray eyes steady, unreadable. It was the only one I intended to give. One of the attorneys suddenly inhaled sharply. She is correct, he admitted quietly to the Sheikh. The clause would permanently transfer controlling rights to the American board after succession. Silence returned again, heavier this time. Sheikh Omar removed his glasses slowly, disappointment flickering across his face as he turned toward Ethan. That would have cost my family everything. Ethan looked genuinely blindsided now. Not embarrassed. Not angry. Worse. Suspicious. His eyes shifted immediately toward his own senior legal advisor seated near the end of the table, a nervous man in his late 50s whose forehead had suddenly begun to shine beneath the warm overhead lights. Claire noticed it too. She said nothing. She simply lifted the silver tray again and stepped back from the table as though she had not just stopped a billion-dollar disaster with a single sentence. Invisible once more, or at least trying to be. The tension in the private dining room did not disappear after the mistake was discovered. It changed shape. What had begun as confidence now felt sharp, unstable. Ethan Calloway remained seated at the long walnut table, but the control he carried so naturally earlier that evening had started slipping through small cracks he could no longer hide. His senior legal advisor, Martin Graves, cleared his throat and adjusted his tie for the third time in less than a minute. There may have been a translation misunderstanding, Martin said carefully, forcing a strained smile toward Sheikh Omar. Arabic legal terminology can sometimes... No. Claire interrupted softly from beside the wine station. Every head turned toward her again. She did not sound emotional. She sounded tired. Not this terminology. Martin's face tightened immediately. Ethan noticed it. So did the Sheikh. Claire stepped closer to the table again, setting down a fresh pot of tea with steady hands while warm light reflected across the polished silver lid. The clause uses inheritance language tied specifically to Gulf succession law, she explained calmly. It was written to appear temporary in English while remaining permanent in Arabic. One of the Sheikh's attorneys slowly leaned back in his chair. That would require someone fluent in both systems, he murmured. Claire said nothing. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly now, studying her profile beneath the chandelier glow. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she spoke. Not like someone repeating memorized information, but like someone who had lived inside rooms like this before. Rooms where billion-dollar negotiations were decided over silence and wording, and who noticed the detail everyone else ignored. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere above the city. The lights inside the restaurant dimmed briefly before stabilizing again, casting softer shadows across the glass walls and expensive suits. Ethan finally stood. 6'2", controlled posture, quiet authority. Yet somehow the room no longer leaned toward him the way it had an hour ago. It leaned toward the waitress beside the tea service. Claire, he said carefully, reading the name stitched subtly onto her uniform for the first time. How exactly does a midtown waitress know international succession law? Her fingers paused against the handle of the teapot. Just for a moment. Then she answered without looking at him. People end up in different places than they planned. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. That still is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting tonight. Martin suddenly pushed his chair back. Too quickly. This entire conversation is becoming inappropriate, he snapped. We are discussing confidential corporate matters in front of restaurant staff. Claire lifted her eyes slowly toward him then. Calm. Direct. You are discussing attempted fraud, she said quietly. The room froze again. Martin's face drained of color beneath the warm lighting. Ethan turned toward him immediately now, all traces of casual arrogance gone from his expression. Attempted fraud? Martin opened his mouth, but no words came out. And for the first time that evening, Sheikh Omar smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, just knowingly. Because the invisible waitress standing beneath the chandelier had done something none of the executives in that room managed to do. She had exposed the only man actually lying. Martin Graves tried to recover the room with a laugh that sounded thin even to himself. This is absurd, he said quickly, gathering loose papers with unsteady hands. We are allowing a server to derail a confidential negotiation based on assumptions. Not assumptions, Claire replied quietly. Translation. The air inside the private dining room felt heavier now, almost overheated beneath the soft amber chandelier light. Rain continued sliding down the massive windows overlooking Park Avenue, turning the city outside into blurred rivers of gold and white. Ethan Calloway remained standing beside the table, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on Martin with growing suspicion. For years, Ethan had built his empire on instinct. Numbers mattered. Contracts mattered. But reading people, that was where he rarely failed. And Martin was unraveling too fast. Sheikh Omar slowly folded his glasses and placed them beside the contract. "Miss Whitmore," he said calmly, "please explain exactly how the wording was concealed." Claire hesitated. She clearly did not want more attention. Ethan noticed that too. Every time the room focused on her, she seemed to retreat inward instead of stepping forward like most people would. No performance. No ego. Just restraint. She finally walked closer to the contract again, soft kitchen lights spilling across one side of her face from the service hallway behind her. The English version uses the phrase temporary. Transitional authority, she explained carefully. But the Arabic appendix replaces transitional with hereditary. In Gulf legal structure, that changes everything. One attorney muttered something under his breath in Arabic before nodding grimly toward the sheikh. Claire continued. Most American firms would miss it because the sentence appears grammatically correct in both languages. But legally, it creates two entirely different outcomes. Ethan stared at her, not because of the translation anymore, because of the precision, the confidence, the terrifying ease. This was not academic knowledge. This was experience. "You have done this before," Ethan said quietly. Claire's expression barely changed. "A long time ago." "For who?" Ethan pressed. She looked at him then. Calm gray eyes. Exhausted eyes. People with too much money and not enough honesty. The silence after that landed harder than the accusation itself. Martin suddenly stood from his chair. "I am not staying here to be interrogated by a waitress," he snapped. But before he could move, Sheikh Omar raised one hand slightly. The room stopped instantly. Even Martin froze. The older man spoke without raising his voice. "Sit down." Martin obeyed. Ethan noticed that too. Power did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it entered softly, and everyone listened anyway. Claire stepped back again toward the wine station, trying once more to disappear into the warm shadows near the wall. But it was too late for that now. Ethan could feel the entire evening shifting around her presence. One quiet correction had exposed corruption inside his company, embarrassed his legal team, and possibly saved $1 billion international partnership. Yet Claire Whitmore looked less proud than tired, as if she had spent years avoiding rooms exactly like this, only to walk into one again by accident. The meeting should have ended right there. Most billion-dollar negotiations would have collapsed under that kind of accusation. But nobody moved toward the door. Nobody reached for their coat. Because the center of gravity inside the room had changed completely, and everyone felt it. Ethan Calloway walked slowly toward the massive windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, one hand in his pocket, the other pressed against his jaw as he thought in silence. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the clouds, briefly illuminating the sharp reflection of his face against the glass. Controlled, intelligent, but no longer certain. Behind him, Martin Graves sat rigidly in his chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The Sheikh's legal team had already separated the Arabic appendix from the rest of the contract, quietly photographing every page with their phones beneath the warm table lighting. Claire remained near the service station, carefully folding linen napkins with calm precision as though this were still just another Thursday night shift. Ethan turned back toward her suddenly. "You knew immediately," he said. Claire did not look up. "Yes." "How?" "Because whoever wrote the amendment used outdated succession terminology." Ethan frowned slightly. "Outdated?" Claire nodded once. The phrase stopped being used in modern Gulf contracts almost 12 years ago. One of the attorneys looked visibly surprised. "That is true," he admitted quietly. Ethan stared at Claire again. Every answer she gave only created larger questions. This was no longer unusual intelligence. This was specialization. Years of it. "Who were you?" he asked before he could stop himself. The room went still again. Claire's hands paused over the folded linen. Not dramatic. Just still. For a moment, she looked older than 41. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone carrying years they never unpacked. "Someone I do not miss," she answered softly. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, frustrated now. You realize you may have just prevented an international lawsuit tonight. Claire gave a faint shrug. Then that is good for your company. And what is good for you? Ethan asked. That question lingered longer than he expected. Claire finally lifted her eyes toward him. The kitchen lights behind her cast soft shadows across her face while distant thunder rolled over the city again. Quiet, she said simply. Ethan did not know why that answer unsettled him more than everything else she had said combined. Because she meant it. Most people chased importance, recognition, power. But Claire Whitmore looked like a woman trying desperately to escape all three. Sheikh Omar rose slowly from his chair then, smoothing the front of his dark tailored coat. The entire room instinctively straightened. He walked toward Claire with measured steps, stopping only a few feet away from her. Miss Whitmore, he said calmly, you protected my family tonight. Claire shook her head gently. I corrected a contract. The Sheikh smiled faintly. That is how families are protected in my world. For the first time all evening, Claire looked caught off guard. Only slightly. But Ethan noticed it immediately. And somehow, watching the quiet waitress lose her composure for half a second affected him more than watching powerful men lose millions. The atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted again after Sheikh Omar spoke to Claire with open respect. Not admiration. Something deeper. Recognition. The kind, powerful men rarely offered anyone outside their world. Claire seemed uncomfortable with it immediately. She lowered her gaze and stepped back toward the service hallway, reaching automatically for empty crystal glasses as if returning to work could somehow erase the last 30 minutes. But Ethan Calloway was no longer willing to let her disappear. Wait. His voice stopped her halfway to the kitchen entrance. Claire paused slowly beneath the softer overhead lights near the hallway, her silhouette framed by warm reflections from the dining room behind her. Ethan walked toward her carefully now, not with arrogance this time, but curiosity sharpened by instinct. The private room remained silent behind them. Even Martin Graves looked relieved for the distraction. Ethan stopped a few feet away from Claire, close enough to lower his voice. You knew the clause was fraudulent before anyone else at that table, he said quietly. You recognized outdated succession terminology from 12 years ago. You speak formal Arabic better than half the consultants I hire for 6 figures. Claire kept her eyes on the tray in her hands. And Ethan studied her face, searching for cracks in the calm expression she carried like armor. And people do not accidentally learn those things. A long silence followed. Soft jazz drifted through the restaurant again, while distant thunder rolled somewhere above Manhattan. Claire finally answered without looking up. No, they do not. Ethan almost smiled at that honesty. Almost. So what happened? Claire inhaled slowly through her nose. The question clearly reached somewhere she did not want touched. Life, she answered. Ethan shook his head faintly. That is not enough anymore. Claire finally met his eyes then. Gray against blue. Calm against intensity. It has to be. For a second, neither of them spoke. The noise of the city beyond the rain-streaked windows felt very far away now. Ethan noticed small things he had ignored earlier. The faint scar near Claire's wrist. The exhaustion beneath her eyes hidden carefully behind composure. The way she stood like someone always prepared to leave quickly if necessary. Not fearful. Careful. You are hiding from something, Ethan said quietly. Claire's expression tightened for the first time all night. Barely. But enough. Everyone in this city is hiding from something. Ethan should have let it go. He knew that. Yet something about her refusal only pulled him closer to the truth. Because Claire Whitmore did not behave like someone chasing opportunity. She behaved like someone avoiding recognition. Behind them, Sheikh Omar suddenly spoke from the dining table in calm Arabic. The woman does not owe you her history, Mr. Calloway. Ethan glanced back briefly. The Sheikh watched him carefully over folded hands. Wise eyes. Patient eyes. Then the older man added quietly, but if she ever chooses to tell it, listen closely. Ethan looked back toward Claire, but she had already stepped through the service hallway doors into the softer fluorescent kitchen light beyond, disappearing once more into the background noise of dishes, steam, and voices. Invisible again. Except now, Ethan knew she was the most important person in the building. Claire stayed in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes after leaving the private dining room. Long enough for the dinner rush to swallow attention away from her. Long enough for servers carrying trays of steak and wine to move around her without noticing that her hands had stopped working entirely. She stood beside the industrial coffee machine beneath harsh fluorescent lighting, staring at steam rising from a ceramic mug she had not touched. The sounds around her blurred together. Plates clinking, orders being shouted, dishwasher humming in the background. Normal noise. Safe noise. Yet her pulse still had not settled. Claire. She closed her eyes briefly at the sound of Ethan Calloway's voice behind her. Of course he followed her. Men like Ethan never walked away from unanswered questions. She turned slowly. Ethan had removed his suit jacket now. The sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled neatly to his forearms. Without the polished image from the dining room, he looked different somehow. Less untouchable. More dangerous. Because curiosity suited him better than arrogance ever did. The kitchen is for employees only, Claire said quietly. Ethan glanced around at the stainless steel counters and exhausted cooks moving behind them. Then I suppose I should make this quick. Claire waited silently. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice beneath the hum of the kitchen. I ran your name. Claire's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. Ethan noticed immediately. There it is, he murmured. The first real reaction all night. You should leave. You worked in Geneva, Ethan continued softly. International mediation offices. Contract arbitration. Language advisory teams. Claire looked away toward the rain-streaked back exit door. That was a long time ago. You disappeared 8 years ago. Silence. Heavy now? Ethan studied her carefully. No social records after that. No interviews. No professional listings. Nothing. Claire finally looked back at him. Tired gray eyes beneath cold fluorescent light. You investigated me in under 20 minutes. I investigate everyone connected to billion-dollar contracts. Even waitresses? Ethan almost answered immediately, but stopped himself. Because she was right. Earlier that evening, he would never have looked twice at her. That realization sat uncomfortably in his chest now. You were not supposed to be a waitress, he admitted quietly. Claire gave a faint smile without warmth. Neither were most people working in Manhattan. Ethan stepped closer again, lowering his voice further. What happened in Geneva? For the first time since he met her. Claire looked genuinely angry. Not loud. Not dramatic. Worse. Controlled. You do not get to ask me that. Ethan held her gaze anyway. Someone forced you out. Claire laughed once under her breath. Soft. Empty. No. Someone died. The kitchen noise suddenly felt very far away. Ethan's expression shifted instantly. Claire looked down into the untouched coffee again. My younger brother worked security for one of the negotiation teams, she said quietly. Wrong place. Wrong night. After that, I stopped believing powerful people solved anything. Ethan did not speak. Claire inhaled carefully before continuing. So I left. A cook shouted an order somewhere behind them. A timer beeped. Life continued around the silence standing between them. Then Claire looked up one final time. And tonight reminded me exactly why I should have stayed gone. Claire expected Ethan Calloway to leave after that. Most wealthy men did when conversations became uncomfortable enough to feel real. But Ethan stayed exactly where he was beside the industrial coffee machine, while steam curled softly between them beneath the cold fluorescent lighting. He looked at her differently now. Not like a mystery to solve. Like a person carrying something heavy for too long. I am sorry about your brother, he said quietly. Claire lowered her eyes toward the untouched coffee in her hands. Most people say that because they think they are supposed to. Ethan shook his head once. No, I am saying it because I finally understand why you walked away. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. You do not understand anything yet. Ethan accepted that without argument. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, the private dining room continued in low, controlled voices, while servers rushed through the restaurant carrying plates beneath warm evening light. Manhattan moved outside the rain-covered windows as if none of this mattered. Yet inside the kitchen, something had shifted permanently. Ethan leaned back lightly against the steel counter beside him. Martin Graves inserted the clause, he said quietly. Claire did not seem surprised. I know. You knew before tonight? No. But men who manipulate contracts usually move the same way. Ethan looked down briefly, jaw tightening. He has been with my company for 11 years. Claire finally took a sip of the coffee. Cold now. Bitter. Trust does not make people honest. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. That contract would have destroyed everything. Claire looked at him carefully then. No. It would have destroyed your reputation. Ethan frowned slightly. There is a difference. Claire held his gaze for a long moment. For people like you, reputation is everything. The words landed harder than Ethan expected because they were true. Billion-dollar companies survived mistakes all the time. Public trust did not. One international fraud scandal tied to foreign succession law would have followed his name forever. Investors would disappear. Governments would hesitate. Boards would panic. Ethan stared at the kitchen floor tiles for a moment before speaking again. You saved me tonight. Claire immediately shook her head. That was not my intention. Still happened. Silence settled again between them. Softer now. Less hostile. Ethan noticed how exhausted she looked beneath the harsh lights. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally. Like every memory she buried years ago had been dragged back into the room against her will. Then his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. Ethan glanced down at the screen. His expression darkened instantly. Claire noticed. What is it? Ethan looked up slowly. My internal audit team just reviewed Martin's private communications. Claire already knew the answer before he spoke again. He was not working alone. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Ethan locked his phone screen and stared toward the dining room doors. Someone inside my executive board approved the fraud before the meeting even started. Claire closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The part she hated most about powerful people. Not greed. Not ambition. The quiet betrayal hiding beneath expensive suits and polished smiles. Ethan looked back at her carefully. And if you had not spoken tonight, Claire finished the sentence for him in a tired voice. You would have signed your own collapse with a gold pen and a smile on your face. The rain had almost stopped by the time the restaurant finally began to empty. Midnight shadows stretched across the polished floors while the last few guests drifted toward the elevators in low conversations that sounded distant and unimportant now. Inside the private dining room, the contract folders were gone. So was Martin Graves. Security from Ethan Callaway's company had arrived quietly less than 30 minutes earlier, escorting executives into separate black cars waiting beneath the glowing Manhattan streetlights outside. No raised voices. No dramatic scene. Just silence. The kind that follows betrayal when everyone suddenly realizes how close disaster truly came. Claire Whitmore stood alone near the back, entranced, tying her dark coat slowly over her black uniform. The fluorescent kitchen lights behind her flickered softly while cold night air slipped through the partially open service door, carrying the smell of rain and traffic. She looked exhausted, more than Ethan had ever seen from anyone in a single evening. Yet her hands remained steady, calm as always. Ethan approached carefully, stopping several feet away this time instead of crowding her space. He had his suit jacket folded over one arm now, tie loosened slightly. The polished billionaire image finally cracked enough to reveal the tired man underneath. Martin confessed, he said quietly. Claire nodded once as though she expected nothing else. The board member? Ethan exhaled slowly. One of my oldest partners. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not surprised. Just disappointed. Money makes people louder, she said softly. But it rarely makes them better. Ethan looked at her for a long moment beneath the dim back hallway lighting. You could have stayed silent tonight. Claire gave a faint shrug. I almost did. Why did you not? For the first time all evening. Claire smiled without sadness behind it. Small. Honest. Because your Sheikh reminded me of someone my brother respected once. A man who listened before speaking. Ethan lowered his eyes for a second at the mention of her brother. Then he reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not flashy. Just white cardstock with his private number written carefully on the back in dark ink. I know you probably will not call, he said quietly. But if you ever want to leave this place. Claire looked at the card for a moment before accepting it. Not because she trusted him completely, but because for the first time that night, she believed he was trying to become someone worth trusting. Outside, the city shimmered beneath wet streets and distant headlights while steam rose from the subway grates into the cold Manhattan air. Ethan opened the service door for her without thinking. Claire paused beside him before stepping outside into the quiet rain-soaked night. You know, she said softly. The dangerous people are never the loud ones. Ethan looked at her carefully. Claire adjusted her coat against the wind and gave him one final glance. They are the ones everyone assumes belong in the room. Then she disappeared into the city crowd beneath glowing traffic lights and silver rain reflections, calm as silence itself. And maybe that is the real lesson tonight. Sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one nobody bothers to notice until everything almost falls apart. If this story moved you, tell us what you think in the comments, and share a moment when someone underestimated you or surprised you completely.